it's a bit ridiculous to expect women to be beautiful and well groomed and dressed up and essentially define themselves through their sexiness and through their bodies and through their looks, and then at the same time expect that we'll just all give it up one day and be okay with that.
NextFem Podcast, Episode 1. Tara interviews Michaela Boehm, expert on intimacy and sexuality. They explore how business success can hurt your love and sex life and what to do about it, how to attract the kind of man you want, how losing the sexual spark in a relationship can easily be reversed, and whether it's possible to age gracefully. All this and more coming right up.
You're listening to the NextFem Podcast, the place where high-powered women get vulnerable about love, leadership, and what it means to be a modern woman. I'm your host, Tara Padua. Join us at nextfem.com, where you'll find loads of free resources like my free ebook, 9 Mistakes That Kill Your Love Life and Keep You Single. Visit nextfem.com. So our guest today is Michaela Boehm. Michaela teaches and counsels internationally as an expert in intimacy and sexuality at michaelaboehm.com. She is the Kashmiri Tantra lineage holder and a frequent teacher at Esalen Institute, Omega, Kripalu, Shambhala Mountain Center, and The Summit. Prior to venturing out on her own, she co-taught for 13 years with legendary author, spiritual teacher, and sexuality expert David Deida, and spent 19 years as a counselor to Hollywood celebrities, co-founding a Malibu celebrity drug rehabilitation center. Michaela, are you ready to become the next femme?
Oh, absolutely.
Woohoo! So hey, Michaela, take us behind the veil. What else can you tell us about you?
Oh God, I mean, where to start? I think that one of the things that recently has become very important to me, and you said that a little bit with the Kashmiri lineage holder, is that I had a very strong drive from a very early age on towards a specific trajectory, and that trajectory when I was 15 was to be a witch. That was really
Wow.
my career goal. My parents not so much down with the witch thing.
In Germany, yeah.
In Austria,
Okay.
there's a rich tradition of herbal healers and things of that like, and that's really what I was talking about. I had a very strong feeling and a vision, and the vision was that I wanted a house in a country with a big garden. And back then, with 15, I really thought it was going to be herbs and potions and lotions. And I had this vision with 15 that people would come through the back door in the garden, and they would come for remedies.
Wow.
And lo and behold, 32 years later, I live in the country in a house with a large organic garden, lots and lots of animals, and I have my own retreat center on the land. And it looks different, of course. I teach slightly different, but it's still in the realm of remedies, and it's still in the realm of embodied, very close to nature or the source or to our natural state kind of teaching. And very recently, when I looked back on that trajectory, I could see that all the way through I had held somewhat of the vision to having my own space. And so for many years I just traveled, both I had an office that I would go to. I'd teach with David at Omega or Kripalu or Shambhala or anywhere else. I'd travel to Europe and teach there and in other places internationally. And I always wanted a home that could also be the home base in which I could kind of sink in and bring people into a different kind of environment. And at that time, that was really not an option, having been self-employed, all my life pretty much. But somehow I started looking anyway. And then in a very odd turn of events, I had one very famous celebrity client who didn't pay me for a year and a half through a set of circumstances that had to do, with things a bit out of his control. And I stuck with him knowing that it would somehow resolve itself. But I always kind of figured it might not. But so what happened within the span of 3 days was I I found a place I liked. I received the check for a year and a half worth of income, and I put the offer on this house I'm living in, and it was the exact amount that I needed.
Wow.
And
So you really are the witch. That's the sorry.
it somehow it worked out that way. And then I bought this property. It's about 5 acres in Ojai, and then I built a studio, a teaching studio, and I've been teaching there since 2008, and I've hosted David's events there since 2008, and he taught here exclusively for the last 7 years, and I've taught here and all over the world. But this is my home base, and somehow I managed to make it happen.
Somehow it sounds like you fulfilled on your dream of, you're 15. What were you said you were 15? Your child.
15. It was
Yeah.
15, my childhood dream. It looks a bit different, but I have these moments where I walk out. I'm teaching this weekend, so I just set up my studio, and I walk out and I just marvel at the fact that that it all came together, and that the vision that I held back then was so strong that it came through.
Oh, it's impressive. Um, so you have a number of impressive items on your resume. The 13 years of, co-teaching with David stands out, along with I really like how I abbreviated that, David Data, along with the 40,000 hours of counseling,
Mm.
working with Grammy-winning musicians and Oscar-winning actors. By many accounts, you're at or near the top of your game. What's one or two factors that have been most pivotal to your success?
Hmm. I would say that it's a combination of things, one of which is consistency. I've been incredibly um, consistent in my application of energy, so to speak. And meaning, I've worked a lot, and these many, many hours of counseling come from having seen clients every hour on the hour, 8, 9 clients a day, 5 days
Mhm.
a week for many, many years.
Wow.
And then even during the drug rehab years, I would see clients in the evening in my own office, see 8 to 10 people at the rehab, and still teach. And so the consistency piece and the discipline of that was, very important in the beginning years, because I came from Europe, where um, things are very, very different, and I really only wanted to be in the States for 6 months, and then stayed, and then found out that I actually, neither were my qualifications any good here, nor did I have a social security number or papers for that matter. So it was quite a struggle to begin with, and my stubbornness uh, really is to be thanked for not just going back home. I just didn't want to just have failed. And so I worked a full-time job while going to school, while seeing clients in the very beginning,
Wow.
and so on and so on. So the second piece is I've always diversified. I've always have many things going on at the same time. So I've always had a counseling practice. Um, and then I did a couple of years of that rehab in the early 2000s. But even during that time, practice going, I had private clients, high profile private clients as well. And I've always taught by myself as well as with David. So my father was very, very adamant. As a very small child, he told me, the about a chair, a chair with 4 legs being extremely stable, but a chair with 3 legs, or a tripod chair, also being super stable. But if you have a tripod chair, you cannot cut off one of the limbs. That was always his, he'd show me with his hands these little, 3 fingers. And so I learned at a very early age that not having all my eggs in one basket was very important, because it gave me freedom, and gave me the freedom to not have to compromise. I didn't have to see clients I didn't want to see, because I had other sources of income, teaching or the celebrity clients. I didn't have to teach anything I didn't want to teach, because I had private clients, and so on and so on. didn't have to teach at any retreat center I didn't agree with the contract with, because I had my own retreat center. And so I think the key why I'm at where I'm at is that I never felt like I had to do things that compromised me in order to make a living or in order to further my career.
Wow. And was that energy just part of the fabric of who you are, or like where did that energy come from?
I wouldn't say, I definitely would say my parents had a very strong influence on a certain kind of uh, emotional and energetic integrity. But like any woman that I know, I mean, there's women who don't have that. I've not always been the best at eliminating, distractions or setting strong boundaries with people who transgressed.
Mm.
I actually learned that in the course of my career because, of course, when you're in a field where you work with people in areas of sexuality, particularly that can be very dark and slippery and dicey. When you don't set proper boundaries, you get hurt and you get in sticky situations. So over the years, I would say that I've acquired very good boundaries, particularly I'd say in the last few years that game has upped substantially as well.
Wow. And so what would be like, take me through it. Like what would be an example of using that kind of energy, or I think the energy of boundaries?
Well, I would say that any time where things are suddenly required of me that I'm not willing to fulfill, and there is a certain threat of consequences in the monetary or also in the emotional way, I'm much more able to not compromise myself anymore. So, I'm willing to accommodate as far as I can without waking up the next morning and going, I should not have agreed to this.
Mm.
But when I have moments like that, I know I know to tighten up those particular areas. I've gotten very good on always putting a bit of a pause between agreeing to anything, which I didn't used to do. I used to be oh, sure. 'Cause I'm also by nature very generous and very abundant. So I used to always bite off more than I could chew, so to speak. And over the years, I've learned to always say, can I get back to you? Or wait a moment before I agree with something, so that I'm not disappointing people, but so that I'm also not compromising myself and my energy levels and, the quality of my work. So it's a constant, work in progress of not allowing people to transgress in multiple ways.
Hmm. And were these mostly, because you work with, a lot of your work has been around sexuality, and do you work mostly with men, mostly with women? Has that changed?
Um, I would say it's changed in certain ways, or the context has changed in certain ways. I work equally, I would say one third, one third, one third with men, women, and couples. I don't do much private counseling anymore. I have a kind of a roster of six to eight, high profile clients that I do very specific work with in the areas of maximizing performance, not only in the areas of relationship, but in also often in career or in their particular craft. And in that particular roster, it's half men, half women. But in my private practice, before and in the few sessions I still do, these days, it's probably a third, a third, a third, and the context has changed a lot in the last, I would say, as far as what people want, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, how things
Hmm.
have changed for women and stuff like that.
Well, yeah, I'd actually love to talk about that now. Can you, so yeah, like we could talk about maximizing performance, or we could talk about, you know, what what kind of excites you in that?
Mm. Um, I think that the the reason why I kind of also decided to venture out a lot more and on my own is that I feel that the circumstances have changed dramatically in the last 5 6 years, and I've been really on the ground, so to speak, because I teach, many workshops a year all over the world,
Mhm.
and so I get to see the changes firsthand as they occur, and the challenge that women face these days with having to achieve pretty much anything in business they want, both entrepreneurially as
Mhm.
well as now in big corporations, right? It used to be, for the last 10 to 15 years, you could be a woman entrepreneur, no problem. But nowadays, we're looking at women CEOs, we're looking at large corporations, we're looking at heads of state, prime ministers, all kinds of changes have come that make it so that and particularly in Scandinavian countries, right, there's complete equality.
Mhm.
But complete equality, sadly, isn't really such because of the way we are built as women. We're still having the babies.
Hmm.
We're still wanting to raise the babies. We still want to have a romantic life, have moments of, you know, I don't know, losing one's mind in the surrender of a relationship, in sex, in nature, right? And these things are um, easily put second or also somewhat thwarted or cramped by the need to be very strong in business and very directed and very focused and full on. And that particular energy domain of making things done is not the natural energetic home of most women's bodies. Doesn't mean we can't do it, we can, but there's a toll and there's a price to pay. So lots of women nowadays have good careers, but they can no longer find the kind of relationships that they really want. And then on the other end, there's lots of men who have somewhat lost their purpose,
Hmm.
and they've somewhat lost their purpose because of what was asked for um, and expected has changed so rapidly over the last 50, 60 years. And particularly in the last 5 6 years, things have really changed. So men don't always know what to do and where to be, because on one end they get the messages of, well, we don't need you anymore. And it's true, most women don't need men. They want men, but they don't need men. I mean, nowadays you can even buy sperm. You don't actually even you don't actually even need to have sex to have babies. So men in a certain way have become obsolete in the traditional roles. Yet, on the other hand, a lot of the men I work with hear from their women, well, you're not masculine enough. You don't ravish me enough. You don't do this enough. You don't do that enough. But then they've been raised by mothers who said, don't be violent, don't be mean, be respectful.
Hmm.
And society, of course, expects that as well. And so on one end, men are supposed to be very watered down and kind of namby-pamby. On the other end, they're supposed to be these, you know, uh, dark ravishers of masculine strength and force, and at the same time sensitive, mind you. So it's a very odd place that people find themselves in relationship, where there's a lot of confusion and a lot of suffering. Um,
So how can women get you said that we want to find the kind of relationships that we want are sort of harder to find. And I'm kind of hearing that, like, it's just because we're all of us, men and women, are wearing so many different hats.
mhm.
But like, yeah, if we're a career woman and we're modern and we're powered and we pay our own bills and girls run the world, like how do we get, the kind of sex or the kind of, that ravishing type partnership out of
Yeah,
a man?
well, there's many answers to this, and most of my work these days centers around this very heavily, because the important piece to understand is that it is not that you have to choose. It's not an either or.
Hmm.
A lot of the recent teachings have that are out there have emphasized just women being in their feminine, and there's a certain implication that if you're in your masculine, that's a bad thing, which is not true. I think it's completely apropos and right for a woman to be able to, stand her ground in business, be assertive, do what needs to be done, have a goal, follow that goal,
Mhm.
uh, you know, make money, spend money, all of those things that were meant to be the masculine domain and that are considered masculine. The important piece to understand is simply that when you do those actions day in, day out, you train your body to assume the posture, so to speak. These are somatic, meaning in the body occurrences.
Mhm.
Your body takes on the energy and the posture of that doing because we are creatures of repetition, and everything you do a lot becomes your habit. So the same is true for me at the end of a workday, right? And any woman
Mm.
who comes home at the end of a workday, we're somewhat, um, you know, angular and edgy and sharp and a little bit impatient, and we want to get things done. And of course, getting things done is somewhat addictive. So you can go endless with your to-do lists and those things. So the important piece is that in the sexual interactions that we want to have, not every woman, but many women, we want to be the ones being taken somewhere, so to speak. Not only taken sexually, but taken on a trip, taken somewhere new. Those are the kind of impulses that make us open and soft and receptive.
And is that
Uh,
inherently feminine?
that's well, it's difficult to say these things, and that's why
Mhm.
I barely ever want to talk about masculine and feminine
Yeah.
anymore, because it's so outdated, right?
Yeah.
People have such odd ideas about that. In a woman's body, regardless if you're masculine and feminine, or feminine oriented, in a woman's body there's certain principles, and the principles have to do with procreation and biology. One of those principles is that naturally our energy sits in the lower body, in the hips, in the genitals, in the thighs. Um,
Mm.
that's also what's considered feminine, of course, right? The undulating movement of your thighs as you're walking, all of that. But that, of course, has to do with procreation, where the energy, the juice, so to speak, sits. Also, of course, the belly and the lower body is the power center,
Mm.
and that is where most of the power comes from. And so when you are relaxed and when you are not subjected to getting things done, your energy, both in the body and also emotionally, will become somewhat less focused, somewhat less directed, somewhat more undulating, so to speak.
Mm.
So instead of calling that just the feminine, we could also just say that is the pleasure principle. Right. So that's how I like to say it
Oh.
these days, because I don't want to. It's so stereotyped, the masculine, the feminine. So, but the pleasure principle, both in the man and the woman, is the principle of the relaxed, with life, with nature, with creativity, more undulating or chaotic, both mental, emotional, and physical motion. So in a woman, that is native. But of course, if you're strongly masculine oriented, and some women are naturally, they don't want to be feminine, they are
Mhm.
the takers, even sexually. But if you're a woman and you are oriented towards the pleasure principle, that is what feels best. And in that state, you want a man to take you somewhere, so to speak. Now, the masculine in both men and women could be described as the organizing principle. The principle that makes things happen, that pins things down, that creates the river banks to the river of the pleasure principle, so to speak.
Mm.
And so when you come home, having lived with embodying the organizing principle, you're
Mhm.
going to have to switch over into the pleasure principle, which is natural and pleasant for most women, unless you're so much in a rut and you've done so much of the other that you can't snap out of it. But once you understand that you can learn both of these things and practice both of these things, and you can switch, then you could come to the man that you're choosing to organize you, so to speak, right? To penetrate you,
Yeah.
to pin you, to structure you for the sexual experience only, meaning the not even intercourse, but the play between a man and a woman in this case. Could be two men, two women, doesn't matter. But um, relationships are polarized, so there can be only one of each. So when a woman comes home from work being all angular and directed, barking out orders, unless she has an incredibly strong man at home,
Mm-hmm.
he will automatically flip into the other polarity, which is the pleasure principle. So he'll be on the sofa, relaxing with a beer, not knowing where it's going right now, but feeling real pleasure while drinking the beer and maybe watching some sports. And of course, that makes her then much more aggressive and angular, and because now she can trust him and she needs to do it all herself. And, sounds familiar. We've
So,
all been there.
yeah. So how do you, I feel like as you're talking, I'm like, do you come into my living room and notice me? Like, because I've been told, I've been described as unrelenting. I've been described as, driven. And I recognize that it feels like for me sometimes, like it takes a lot of like testosterone.
Yes.
And as I've gotten older, that's definitely shifted, but I still feel like it's hard when you're in that space where you've worked 12 hours or whatever, and you come home and, I would love to be ravished, but most of the time I just can't organize myself. So do you have any advice or tips like for women who, when we're in that state, that we can actually shift, to kind of
Yes.
overcome these challenges? Yeah.
Yes. So the first thing you need to know is you have to give yourself, a bit of compassion there, because it is not easy. If you do something 12, 13 hours a day, that is your primary, MO. It just is. And so coming home and understanding that that's so, instead of putting yet another demand on yourself, be feminine, god damn it, now, it's that's another doing and not being. So the discipline, though, and the consistency that's needed is that you identify, in my case, I have like 5 to 10 hacks, so to speak, that flip me over. And you want to identify them, and then you have to have the discipline to do those things. And once you do those things, they build a momentum of their own, and it goes faster and faster and faster and faster. It's not completely fair to somehow expect for your man to flip you, which also can be done, by the way. So in mixed workshops, we teach specifically how to do that, where men can repolarize their women and how women can repolarize their men. But the do me attitude is also something that can get very egregious in a relationship.
And by
So
do
it's good.
and by do me, it's sort of like lazy, right? Like sort of like expecting people to
Yeah,
take.
expecting your man to somehow get you out of this, which he can, but it shouldn't be a demand. It should be taken as a gift. So it's good if you have hacks of your own, so to speak, that you can use. So here's a few principles. You can find your own. I'll tell you some of mine,
Great.
perhaps. But a few principles are to come back into the body. Right? The pleasure principle is located in the body. It's feeling things, touching things, eating things, doing things, moving things that bring you back in the body, while organizing and pushing and, like you said, unrelentlessness happens in the head. So one of the principles is do things that get you in the body. Could be a bath, could be putting music on, dancing to just 1 or 2 songs, really shaking it out. Could be connecting with your animals if you have animals. I have, a shitload of animals. So I have fluffy dogs, soft dogs, rough dogs. I have every texture dog that you can imagine. So touching them, connecting with animals, connecting with your children if you have children, making time to eat something that's not just perfunctory, but that gives you some pleasure. Connecting with someone who has a softening, calming influence on you, listening to something, maybe listening to something on the way home instead of making phone calls till the moment you walk in the door. So those are some of the things that you want to consider is aspects of bringing you back in the body and connecting you back with things that remind you that you are love,
Hmm.
like nature, animals, art, music, things of that nature.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm like, it sounds like things that remind you that you're alive, that you're a living, breathing, oxygen pulsing through your skin, and that this is sort of a joyous thing that we get to do, which is live,
Yes. Yeah.
as opposed to that driving forward or that kind of organizing principle that you were talking about. What
Say
about
that again. You broke up for a second. What was the last sentence?
um I was like, it's different than that driving, organizing principle
Yes.
that
Yes.
you were talking about before.
Yes, which creates a certain tension in the body that goes upwards,
Hmm.
right? So one of the things that you'll notice in most people when you have um, a lot of thinking, a lot of computer work, a lot of doing, a lot of directing, your energy tightens your core and it moves upwards. So most women have jaw, neck, shoulder aches and pains, tension, and the core gets tight. So you want to essentially, do anything that brings the energy down and relaxes the core.
And what do you recommend for? I feel like I talk to a lot of women and they're not even having sex. They're not even, like they're wiping poo off the, the walls and
Yeah.
kind of like what advice do you have for those women, who are like, I'm so in this energetic space of having to get stuff done, you know.
Done. I know. Yeah.
Is it a boundaries thing, like kind of like you were talking about earlier with yourself, like sort of establishing like what is it?
Well, it's one of the other things, of course, that has come with this whole movement of pushing the feminine kind of as a religion in a certain way is a certain pressure to be everything,
Hmm.
right? It's completely normal when you have just had a baby and you're working full time and like you said, you're wiping poo off the walls when you come home. You're not the sexiest creature. You're just not. And that whole idea of you have to be everything to everyone, it's just so oppressive, right? So it's important once again to cut yourself some slack and feel what would make the biggest difference in the smallest ways. Um, and identify that maybe you only have 5 minutes a day to yourself. Maybe
Hmm.
it's just a bath at the end of the day, a hot bath. That's the only thing that can be done for the time being. And I think it's very important to not focus on the sex, which can once again be performance and acceptance and all of those things, but focus on pleasure, small sensual pleasures, things that are not necessarily sexually in their nature, but that reopen the body to that experience.
And I'm hearing that rather than again expecting the world to do you or sort like this magical, the world to organize themselves around getting you into that state, it's actually to kind of do little things, whatever it is. I
It's
forgot how you said
all
it.
about little things. Yeah.
The maximum, yeah. That's what do you say about you kind of mentioned earlier about the kind of dark side, and I want to and connected that somehow to men. Can you talk about that?
You mean the dark side, as in the darker energies of sexual interaction,
Yes, you can
or
tell
that,
that.
or yeah,
Well, yeah, like I just like I'm kind of intrigued by that, right? Because yeah, that
yeah.
how you said it was better. Yes.
Well, because there's also, of course, the shadow, right? I was trained originally Jungian, so there's shadow work, but I think what we're talking about is more the darker registers of sexual expression.
Hmm.
And so just to give you a bit of an overview, one of the ways that we can look at that is this is I mean, it's endless, and we're just touching on things. When you begin training your body to be able to access the pleasure and the feminine, and then of course that also repolarizes your partner if you have one, or it attracts the kind of man who wants that, right? One of the problems that a lot of the women I work with, I have a few very, very successful actresses I work with, and a CEO of a big company, is that they want strong men,
Hmm.
but somehow they end up with these soft, somewhat directionless guys, and even guys who were strong become weaker as they are in a relationship, and that comes from um, occupying that space, that masculine space. So when you know how to repolarize when you come home, so to speak, soften yourself, make yourself receptive, you attract the different men.
So it's not
Uh,
about, sorry, it's not about, because I think a lot of, like a lot of women I talk to, like we think that we have to contract or somehow be smaller, which to me kind of indicates more control, more of that organizing energy. And really what I'm hearing though is like you're kind of rebalancing yourself, you know?
Yes, you're rebalancing yourself. Then there's other interactions, but of course that depends on the man and things like that. So we always have to start with ourselves there. Um, and but coming to the dark part, so once you know how to do that, then within that, um, there is what I would call flavors or spices, so to speak. And these spices or flavors are different expressions of the feminine or the masculine if it's a man. And so in sexual polarity, in which is the arc of sexual attraction, the rule, so to speak, it's like physics, is that there can only be one of each. So if somebody occupies the masculine, the other person will automatically flip into the feminine. If they don't, there is fighting. If both people are in the feminine, nothing gets done, and it's very pleasurable and playful, but there's no sexual spark. So when two people come together, one of them willingly, for that moment, embodies the pleasure principle, and one person for that moment embodies the organizing principle. Now, that could change even within the sexual interaction back and forth, but there's only one of each. So once you know how to access those um, embodied principles, then to make things interesting and keep them spicy for longer periods of time, you add flavors to it. And the flavor is a register from very sublime light to very nasty, kinky dark, so to speak. Now, the important piece is that in order for this to work, the hearts need to be connected. Right? If you're just doing these things rotely, you might as well go to an S&M club or something like that, right? Not to say that there isn't people in that scene who are also very heart connected, but in general, the more rote things, or even a strip club, it's not very heart connected. What makes it sublime, the darker energies as well as the lighter energies, is when it's between two people who have opened their hearts to each other and they are present with each other. All of those things, when I teach, are parsed out and taught separately. You first learn how to be with each other, then you learn how to open your hearts with each other, then you learn how to establish polarity, which, by the way, is way easier to establish than deep love between two humans. Right? So even people who've lost the spark can relearn that very easily because it's principles. While, of course, if you've lost love, that's much harder to handle. But once you know how to establish the polarity with the heart connection, then you add certain energies kind of as a spice ever so often. And most people, not all, because there's trauma and abuse and past, history and stuff like that, but most people tend to find the darker, nastier, kinkier, whatever you want to call it, energies much more enlivening. Their bodies become much more alive. They get much more turned on if it's a little bit dirty, if it's a little bit nasty, right? And so a perfect example for that is the incredible success of 50 Shades of Grey, right? Which is it's baffling, but it's not, because it's a spice that most people don't get because people are not skilled and they're scared. And there's a lot of stigma, and that you can do horribly wrong, right? Of
Hmm.
course, if you don't know what you're doing, you smack somebody and they hit their head on the wall or something. So in the emergency room and arrested for domestic violence, and you just wanted a little bit of, dirty talk or something like that.
You
All of
left me
which
in the closet for 2 days.
yeah, exactly. Um, so, you know, but most people find that very enlivening and they don't get it. And so, much like if you haven't had salt for a while, right, you start
Hmm.
craving these things. And you start craving them by, reading things like 50 Shades of Grey, and that enlivens the body somehow, right? Or
Hmm.
watching porn, or, in the extreme case, people start looking at the news and gorge themselves on horrible rape stories, or and it becomes very perverted. I think Game of Thrones is also a good evidence of how much darkness people crave in their sex lives, right? Because when you look at that, that's a pretty damn violent series, but people love it because it gives them a kind of non-personal taste of that kind of dark energy. So when that dark energy is converted lovingly into sexual play and in sexual expression, it nourishes quite deeply. And a lot of women fantasize. When you hear women's fantasies, I'm sure you've heard that,
Hmm.
they're quite, they're quite dark.
Yeah, it's like we're not fantasizing about. I mean, sometimes I do about getting my guy to put on some warm slippers for me and make me a cup of tea, but
Exactly, and
uh,
tell you how beautiful you are, and
often it's just like I want him to love me deeply, but be filthy, you know. Like,
exactly. So that's
that's
a huge area. Exactly. You want it a bit dirty. You want a little bit of a dirty text ever so often or something. So you feel that aliveness, right? And that aliveness then, of course, brings you into your body and softens you and opens you up. And so that whole area, when taught properly, um, enriches a relationship so much.
mm,
And it's quite lovely. I have a male co-teacher who is kind of specialized in that particular area, worked with men for many years on how to bring that in a loving way, right? Not in a manipulative or nasty way, but in a loving way. So um, we've been really recently diving into these areas where you can teach people how to stay heart open in some pretty dark situations, and it makes such a difference.
so I think for women, if I were listening to this, some women were like, yes, like bring on the spice. But I think really what I'm hearing is that it really is just a spice. It's, and kind of being proactive about having that range, for yourself, for your own pleasure.
Yeah, you don't want it all the time. You don't want to be in some constant Christian Grey fantasy scenario. Most women have a life, and there's other things to life as well. You want it ever so often, then you want it really good. And then what happens, of course, is it relaxes you completely, right? It makes you mindless. Your body opens, your heart opens, and then you are much better equipped again to go out in the world and do what you need to do. And of course, 50 Shades of Grey is just a fairly bubblegum pop culture guesstimation of what's possible between two people who have an actual relationship where that's part of the play, and it can be refined and personalized and
It might be fun to see
worked
like
with.
it might be interesting to see like the fun, healthy version of that, like the true, because
Mhm.
there was a lot of like therapeutic issues that that I think were sort of stepped over. Um,
Yes,
yeah.
of course.
Michaela, I know that we're sort of approaching the end, and I wanted to touch on this at all, if possible, sort of quickly. And I don't know if it's possible, but I'm going to throw it out there. Um, we, what about beauty and aging and this kind of sexuality? Like, could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Hmm. Well, you had in your original questions, you had me sent me something about what's still raw or incomplete for me, which I thought was such a great question, which of course leads into this. I think that as a woman and having had, I mean, there's very few things I haven't achieved in my career, right? And I think I'm not completely at the peak yet, but I've done pretty much everything I wanted to do and very full on. And now that I stepped out on my own, which is very scary in a certain way, but also feels incredibly important as a woman to, be kind of empowered to really follow my own through line. But I'm 48, and there's part of me that thinks, well, I should have stepped out completely and completely shown people who I am earlier. But it is, of course, a matter of aging and maturity, and having learned certain things and having certain experiences under your belt. But now I'm 48, and I teach, women who are 18, 19. I also teach women who are in their 70s. So I get, particularly at women's retreats, right? There's a full range of of ages, and the challenge of age, to me, has become a very strong focus, because of course it is true that as you gain um, expertise and maturity, and also, of course, in women, sexual maturity comes a bit later in life. Most women report that in their 40s they have the most pleasure, they know their bodies the most, they're relaxing a bit more, their bodies open a bit more, they can choose good lovers, they make better choices in men, all of those kind of things. So our sexual peak comes at a time where our physical peak is kind of over. I mean, of course, things change dramatically now with, anti-aging medicine and all of those things, but it's inevitable that we age. And, on one end, we don't want to put too much emphasis on our looks, but on the other end, um, most women I know, including myself, have spent a lot of time and a lot of effort in looking a certain way, and dressing a certain way, and shoes and dresses and makeup and hair is a pleasurable and an enjoyable thing, aside from having to be a certain way to attract a good mate, which is true because men are strictly visually oriented sexually. That doesn't mean that there isn't other things that play a role, but just from a first hit, men, evolutionarily speaking, are visually oriented. So it's very, very hard to go from, um, you know, having to be beautiful and vibrant and youthful and glowing to aging, and then somebody says to you, well, you got to age gracefully. I mean, at one point it goes, and then you have your wisdom and your experience. Well, I can tell you, I mean, certainly in my 30s, I look down on women who had plastic surgery or things like that. I mean, a lot, right? And I would never do this. I would just age gracefully. Now with 48, I just had new bio photos taken. I look at those and I go, shit, this doesn't even look like me. That the shock of how I feel internally, which is not much different, like you were saying. There's a part of me that's still 20, and I've looked the same more or less for the last 20 years. And now suddenly I'm aging quite dramatically, because also I travel a lot. And, I mean, and it comes in waves. It's not easy. And it's not as simple as, well, just accept it, stop dyeing your hair and have some grace about it. It's much more um, finding the fine balance between surrendering into what's inevitable, which aging is, right? Even if you have procedures done, um, which, at this point, I'm not advocating, but I'm no longer, down on anybody doing it, because there's things that can be done very easily that make a huge difference. So it's not that you should just give it up and, close up shop and be done with it, but it's also um, a matter of surrendering into life, and accepting what's happening, which is, I'm going to look back at these bio photos even 5 years from now and go, wow, I still looked really good back then. Right. And I will have aged another 5 years. And then in 5 years from then, that will look really good. So There's an acceptance of how it is right now, an acceptance or surrender into the inevitability of aging, and at the same time, a focusing on a vibrance and a strength and a radiance that comes from something else than your looks. And that's physical, right? That's how much you are in your body. That's how much you are enlivened by nature and by life. And you know that from women who are very radiant and older. It doesn't have to do anything with how much wrinkles they have. It has to do with how much life force they conduct through their body. I don't know who, if you know who Angela Farmer is. She's a yoga teacher, and I think she's probably in her 60s or maybe even, I'm not quite sure, but she has this long white hair and this very craggly face. And she is so beautiful and so sexy because her body is just alive.
Oh,
Yeah.
thanks for,
And so
yeah.
yeah, the last thing I want to say about it is it's a fine line between not letting it go, not giving up, doing what can be done, having a good exercise regime, having a certain attitude, at the same time surrendering to the inevitable and cultivating something else.
It's amazing because it really brings, thank you for sharing that so vulnerably, because it really, I just, it totally resonates. And again, I can hear your stubbornness and your consistency and the discipline that you talked about earlier, sort of like just being willing to grapple with this,
Mm,
like, no, I'm not going to be on the shelf, and no, don't tell me that I need to, but really kind of bringing, all your heart to it. So thank you. Oh,
thank you.
well, I think we're sort of at the end, so I'm going to switch gears. Do you know what time it is, Michaela?
Oh, most definitely.
It's time for
What
the
time is
it's time for the
it?
Fem 5. Are you ready?
I am so ready.
Okay, your favorite book you like to suggest for women?
There's two. I'm gonna have to say two. There's Women Who Run with the Wolves.
Mm.
Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who is really a hero of mine for many, many reasons. But it's an incredible book that isn't. It doesn't go indirectly. It's not a how-to book. It's not at five tips for success. It appeals to the more mystical and kind of primal side of women, and it's been around for I think almost 30 years. It's a classic. And then there's a book by a woman called Shubhra Krishan. It's called, I think, Everyday Ayurveda,
Mm.
and it is probably the book with the best um, hacks, like small hacks for kind of a pleasurable everyday living. And she does it so very beautifully, where she talks about things you can do in the car, things you can do for food,
Mm.
um, little scents. It's just a lovely book to remind ourselves of the tiny little things that you can do in a few seconds.
Oh, so good. Favorite self-care hack?
Yes, favorite self-care hack. I would say the one thing that I never go without unless I'm traveling somewhere where that's absolutely not available is a hot bath at the end of the day.
Mm.
And my hot bath always includes magnesium flakes. I get these European magnesium flakes because remineralizing or refilling the body with magnesium subdermally is the one thing that makes the greatest difference in tension levels and sleep.
A valuable mentor you'd like to acknowledge?
I would say my first teacher. She died a couple of months ago. She was the woman I inherited the lineage from. She taught me for 10 years from when I was 16 to 26, and she instilled in me, essentially, she made me who I am today, for sure.
And what was her name?
Deepa.
Deepa.
Mhm.
Female CEO or thought leader you're into right now?
I think one of the people I admire most is a woman named Ushi Gibson. Not very well known, but you can look her up. She is a woman who moved from the US to India and to Varanasi in India, and she formed a women's self-empowerment center there. And she, on her own, completely grassroots, made it possible Two, she found a place that's somehow connected to the Krishnamurti Foundation here in Ojai. And she found women who still had the skills of the ancient stitching and embroidering techniques that were native to Varanasi. And she sourced material, all these women, and taught them how to do these techniques. She creates a line of clothing every year that she brings over, like tunics and kind of yoga, Indian inspired things, but very modern and very beautiful. She worked in the fashion industry.
One thing you'd tell your 5 years younger self.
Stop pushing so hard. So, I'd say that it took me till fairly recently to realize that getting things done didn't necessarily mean I had to push with all my might. I've relaxed substantially over the last probably 5 years. And if I would have known how to do that earlier, I think I'd have a few less gray hair.
Awesome. Congratulations, Michaela. It's official. You are the next femme.
Well, thank you very much.
Where can people find you online if they want to connect and hang out with you more?
My website is my full name, which I'm assuming you put somewhere in a link, right? But I'll spell it. It's Michaela, B as in boy, Oehm as in Mary. So michaelaboehm.com. And on there are all my events for the year. I'm going to teach in Europe, in Australia, and in the US this year. There's also lots and lots of free recordings on the blog site. I'm going to start posting content weekly now. And then there's courses and audio downloads and all other kinds of stuff that you can find on my site.
Great. I also understand you have a free gift for NextFem Nation. Tell us about it.
Yes, I figured I'll make one of my recent recordings available. It's called The Wild Woman's Way, which is one of the programs I teach. It's a curriculum. And this particular recording is called The Wild Woman's Way, Rewilding and Surrender. And it talks quite in detail about many of the things that we've covered now. It's an excerpt from a workshop, so you get a bit of an idea of what's presented in a workshop. And then, of course, there's lots and lots of bodily exercises that I can't record, but this gives a good idea of some of the deeper principles between, in the things that we've just talked about.
Thank you so much. So friends, you can grab Michaela's free gift at nextfem.com/wild women's way. Say that 12 times. All right, NextFem Nation, thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you could join us. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd be so grateful for a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. Every one makes a huge difference and will also earn you a shout out on nextfem.com. Subscribe for more great interviews like this one, and if you're getting this episode anywhere but my website, head over to nextfem.com and join my free email newsletter so we can keep in touch. And until next time, be great and take exquisite care.